Alright, so it says if a point's on the perpendicular bisector, so you have to make sure it's on the perpendicular bisector. And I've already explained to you earlier why this is a perpendicular bisector. If a point's on the perpendicular bisector, then it's equidistant to the endpoints. So for instance, if you were to draw a line from C to A, and then a line from C to B, these two sides would be congruent. And that goes for anywhere on the perpendicular bisector. I could put a point right here and call it point B. And if I measured from D to B, let's pretend like that's a straight line, and then from A to D, those would be the same. They would be congruent. Okay? So as long as it's on the perpendicular bisector, it's going to be equidistant to the endpoints. Now, that also goes backwards. If I know a point, let's say I have a point E down here, and I know from E to A is 14, and from E to B is 14, then I know it's on the perpendicular bisector. Then I know these two sides are congruent. Okay? All right, so now let's get into some actual math, how we're going to use this for math. And this is where you could possibly need your calculator, depending on how good you are at adding. All right, so if there's any numbers, I don't think I erased any numbers on the teacher model, so I'm pretty sure that's on there. But it says find the length of RS. Now, looking at it, I want to assume that RS and SP are the same. However, I've got to make sure that S is on the perpendicular bisector. All right, so if S is on the perpendicular bisector, then they're the same. Okay, well, it's a right angle, so that's perpendicular. And then bisector means these two would be congruent, and they are, so it is. So these two sides are congruent, therefore SR would have to be 6.8. All right, what questions do you have for me? Okay. Let's move on, let's do one together. Find the length of EG. Find the length of EG. So first, I noticed that FG is 9.5. And they want EG, which is all the way from E all the way to G. Okay? So they want this whole thing. Well, first thing I noticed that these two sides here are both 24. So that means they're congruent. All right, so since these two sides are congruent, that means H is 24 units to G, and H is 24 units to E. All right, so Alexis R., what does that tell me about this line EF?
That's on the midpoint.
Yeah, it's on the midpoint. And since it's on the midpoint, what does that tell me?
That it's
What's congruent?
The
E to G.
EF and FG?
Yes.
Yeah, these two are congruent. So if FG is 9.5, Dylan, what's EF going to be?
9.5.
All right, and then Kaylee, how am I going to find EG?
You add them together.
Perfect. You just add them together. So you do 9.5 plus 9.5. And Portia, what's 9.5 plus 9.5? 19. Perfect. Okay. All right, let's try another one together. This one's another one you're going to have to fill in the number because I erased it. All right, Sierra, explain to me the thought process on how to find the length of segment CD.
Is on the side perpendicular line. That would make CD 27.
How did you know that D was on the perpendicular bisector?
Because A, E, and EG were congruent.
Yeah, these two are marked congruent, and that's a perpendicular symbol. That means a right angle. So that means these two sides would be congruent. Okay. Now, I think that's our last one on chunk one. Okay. What questions do you have for me about perpendicular bisectors? Move on to chunk 2. And I forgot to delete that one. All right, angle bisectors. Angle bisectors. An angle bisector is a ray that divides an angle into 2 congruent angles. A ray that divides an angle into 2 congruent angles. So if they ever tell you that something bisects an angle, you can automatically mark those 2 small angles congruent. Okay? So, in my picture, you see those 2 angles at the bottom, BAD and DAC? They're marked congruent, therefore I know AD, ray AD, is an angle bisector. And what the angle bisector theorem says is, if a point lies on the bisector of an angle, then it is equidistant from the 2 sides of the angle. If a point lies on the bisector of an angle, then it's equidistant from the 2 sides of the angle. So, point B. How can I tell that this is an angle bisector? You're good. You're answering my question. You're not asking me a question. Fine.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking it, please.
Okay.
It goes through it
Okay, how do you know it bisects it?
because it has the 90-degree angles
Not necessarily.
and it has the matching angles at the bottom.
Yeah, it has these 2 marked congruent. So it has those 2 marked congruent. That means it's an angle bisector. Now, what it says is any point there is equidistant to the sides. Now, there's 2 things you got to make sure. You've got to make sure it's an angle bisector, and these have to be perpendicular because the shortest distance is the perpendicular distance. So you have to have these perpendicular symbols here in order for it to count. But if these perpendicular symbols are here and these 2 angles are congruent, then you can make this side congruent to that side. And vice versa. If they have the 2 right angles and they have these 2 sides marked congruent, then you can say that these 2 angles are congruent. So these 2 angles make these 2 sides congruent. These 2 sides make these 2 angles congruent. It goes both ways. All right, let's do an example. And there's one of these examples that don't match your paper, so whenever I get to it, I think I remember which one it is. All right, it says find the measure of angle GFJ. Okay, well first I got to figure out which angle is GFJ. So if I follow the path G to F to J, that's this angle right here. So they want that little angle on top. Well, first thing I notice is that this side is 7 and that side is 7, so they're congruent. And I notice that these are right angles. So that means that these 2 angles here would be congruent. So if this angle is 42 degrees, that angle is also 42 degrees. So the measure of angle GFJ is 42 degrees. All right, like I said, these notice we're already pretty much almost done with the notes. We don't have very many problems left to do on these notes. These will go very quickly. It's an easy section. We'll finish them tomorrow, and you will get your assignment to work on after we do the notes. What questions do you have for me before you put your stuff right up? Okay. All right, you put up your calculators and get your phones. If you borrow colored pencils or highlighters or markers, put them back in the bucket.